Hello and welcome to the Play-by-Play, a sports media talk show from the fine folks at Awful Announcing, where we are back on a Wednesday, 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and we have a trio of good topics for you. We are going to get to Paul Finebaum's future. We're going to get to Max Kellerman's breaking of silence. But first, Brendon, we're going to talk about the NFL's record-breaking Thanksgiving Day ratings. Hot off the presses, we just got these numbers, Brendon. 57.2 million viewers for CBS on the Kansas City Chiefs-Dallas Cowboys game. That was in the late afternoon window. We got 47.7 million for Fox's early afternoon game between the Packers and the Lions. And then 28 million for NBC's primetime game between the Bengals and the Ravens. Those were all records for their respective windows, and the CBS game broke the previous record for most watched regular season game in NFL history. Brendon, this is pretty much expected given the Nielsen changes, the expansion of out-of-home viewing, the big data plus panel, stuff we've talked about a lot on this podcast. But were you surprised at the magnitude of these numbers when you saw them come out?
Yes, but at the same time, I think we're all just in this zone where we don't know the reality of any of this. And I hate to always bring it back to that. Like, we should focus on this, right? I think Chiefs Cowboys accomplishing what we thought it might by delivering a good game, and all this, the Cowboys did the NFL a big favor by getting their act together in time for this one to pay off. Like, if it had continued to be the defensive disaster it had been earlier in the season, it probably wouldn't have gotten to this point. All that sort of stuff. Joe Burrow coming back, like, everything lined up. The movement of the windows to be closer to a regular Sunday. Like, the NFL wanted this to happen. They put a lot of effort into making this, and the numbers, the audience was there for it. But I don't know if that would have been true if not for some of the, panel measurements that Nielsen does now, the out-of-home viewing, all this sort of stuff, the new platforms that the games are available on, like Peacock or Fox One or Paramount Plus or whatever. It just feels like every time I see a number like this, I can analyze it the way I just did, but then I also have not even a whisper in the back of my head, like a shouting in the back of my head that's like, this might not even be the truth. And so I end up with more questions than answers.
Yeah, you're completely right. And it doesn't even get into the fact that, like, some of these streaming services are measured by, like, a totally different company. Like, Adobe will do the measurements for a lot of these streamers. So, like, any viewership on, like, Tubi or Fox One is going to be measured by a company that's not even Nielsen. And then the figures are combined. So it's a whole shit show when it comes to how these are actually measured. But the thing that did stand out to me, Brendon, was the percentage increase year over year for these games. Kind of far outweighs what you would expect just from, the out of home viewing and the big data plus panel boost. The Cowboys game jumped 47% year over year. Granted, that was versus last year's game, which I don't know if you remember, featured two backup quarterbacks and was like a multi-year low for Cowboys Giants on Thanksgiving. I think that game only got around like 38 million viewers.
So that was the one where Brady went off on Daniel Jones, right? Wasn't that the whole wanting to do the practice squad safety that L. Duncan said it, and then Brady kind of hammered Jones on it, and that was like the big storyline coming out of the game because the football was such a disaster on the field.
Right. So, 47% jump from that is, I guess, not all that surprising considering the circumstances. Now you got, the two most popular viewership teams playing. They're both in the playoff hunt. It's Patrick Mahomes, Dak Prescott, etc. But that's still a lot more than kind of the 5, 10, 15% boost that most live sports viewership is getting for the out-of-home boost. And then the Lions game, I think, is a little bit more telling even. That saw a 28% year-over-year increase. And last year's Lions-Bears game on Thanksgiving was actually a record for an early window Detroit Lions Thanksgiving game. So that one went up about 10 million from 37 million last year to 47 million this year.
Which was one of like the only good wins of Caleb's rookie season, right? So that I think that was kind of the headline of that game. Maybe people tuned in as it went on because of that aspect of it. You don't know for sure, but that makes sense. Yeah, and it's interesting that it's building. It's not just a flash in the pan because of some of these wonky numbers.
Yeah. So I think, like we mentioned, it's really hard to kind of weigh the magnitude of these audiences. We don't know how much bigger in reality these numbers were compared to last year or the year before that. But I think it's safe to say that NFL's strategy this year of putting really high quality games on Thanksgiving did pay off. I mean, we've seen some real dogs of matchups in the past 5 years on Thanksgiving. I mean, I think the Cowboys and Commanders have played multiple times in that span. And the Commanders were not good until last year. The Detroit Lions were horrible until the Dan Campbell era started. So, putting these actually high quality teams in the Thanksgiving window, I think did help improve the ratings, but it is just so hard to kind of suss out what these numbers actually mean.
Yeah, it's hard to say, like, outside of, I mean, you could talk about like populations in the different markets and quality of teams and stuff like that, obviously, but just like in a vacuum, like a 1995 Thanksgiving game feels like apples and like cups, to compare. It's like, I don't even know how to say if are more people watching these games than back then. It feels like I can't possibly know the answer to that, even though it's more accessible than ever. And obviously sports seem to be the thing people continue to tune into over, the Thanksgiving Day parade or some of the other stuff. Like I get all that, but again, very confusing. One thing I wanted to point to here though is milking holidays clearly is working for the NFL. I mean, they've always done Thanksgiving, but as you said, scheduling real games that people care about and making this matter, having that night game, which hasn't always been there, things like that. And they're doing it on Christmas. They're doing it wherever. Every league should be learning this lesson in a real way because there's holidays that the NFL does not dominate. And frankly, the NBA even had a really solid Christmas last year. But like I look at what NBC is going to be doing, it's a little wonky this year because 4th of July in 2026 is on a Saturday, but they're doing what they're calling a roadblock on July 5th, which will have all 30 teams playing games that will exclusively be broadcast on Peacock and NBC. And things like that, every league and network should be trying to figure out ways to manufacture attention like that. Even if it's ridiculous, even if it's preposterous, go play a game in a cornfield, go play a game at a NASCAR track, go play a game wherever. The stuff Caitlin Clark was doing at, different arenas, and they've done volleyball at football stadiums. I know that's not holidays, but, if you can meld big high profile games and matchups with days that you can have attention on that people are available to watch, like that feels like an absolute no-brainer. And it almost feels crazy that we ever unlearned that lesson or maybe just took it for granted and stopped making it a priority. But, the last thing I would say is the college football playoff doesn't seem to take full advantage of some of that stuff like they should. And that was a talking point last year. And I feel like they absolutely should be doing it. Can you do Christmas Eve? Can you do more games on the 31st than just the one that they have scheduled? Stuff like that, I think, would go a long way. And that's the lesson I take because the NFL is going to continue to dominate. But, big picture, that's the lesson for me.
Right. I think it's just a shift in mindset from a lot of these network executives, these programmers, and these schedule makers that decide when the games are played. Because 5 years ago, you did not have out-of-home viewing at all accounted for in the Nielsen measurements. Now you have 100% of the country being measured for out-of-home viewing. And we all know it's very clear at this point. The data shows on holidays, out-of-home viewing shoots up. I mean, it's quite obvious.
I
if you
had
think about
15
it.
people watching my TV out here for these games we're talking about, and that could have only gotten counted as one before.
Exactly. So there's just a lot more upside to playing on holidays now, and I think leagues and network executives are starting to realize that and act accordingly. So we'll leave that there for now, Brendon. I kind of, my eyes glaze over if we talk about ratings too long. So I kind of want to get to Paul Finebaum and his decision not to run for the U.S. Senate. Were you surprised by this, Brendon? I think the conventional wisdom here is if you go on to Outkick and talk to Clay Travis, and then you go on Buck and Sexton and talk about running, a week or two ago, everyone kind of assumes you're going to run, but he decided now is not his time, and perhaps it looks like maybe he still has a future at ESPN. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, Paul Finebaum's 70 years old. This felt like partially a retirement plan, as odd as that sounds, right? Like, he wins, he's in the Senate till he's almost 80, and then he goes on with his life. I think it's almost like one of the more normal Charlie Kirk related stories we got, which is somebody was driven to potentially actually, get involved with politics because they were so aghast at the state of the country. And then for whatever reason, he hasn't really explained exactly what went into why he was going to do it and now he's not and all those sorts of things. But I would hope he would maybe just realize that he's probably not the best guy for that job, even if he could win. And I'm just going to choose to look at it through rose-colored glasses and think maybe Paul Finebaum is seeing what all of us know, which is that a sports host probably shouldn't be in the Senate, despite all of the things telling us he would have been an incredible likelihood to win that seat because of his name recognition and fame. Probably not the guy who should be one of 100 people running the country. So salute for him realizing that and backing off.
Yeah, I'm pouring one out for us here at Awful Announcing for like the dozens and dozens of posts that we probably would have gotten out of a Paul Finebaum Senate run. But I do think you're kind of spot on here where Finebaum's a really smart guy. Like if you listen to him in interviews, like he has an awareness that I don't know a lot of other people in his similar positions to him have, which I think was the most surprising part about him floating a Senate run is like he seems like someone that could acknowledge those realities that maybe he is not one of the 100 people that should be sitting in a Senate seat. But I digress. So what do you think his future is at ESPN? Because I think that's the big question now.
Yeah.
We were all kind of assuming that maybe this is the end of Paul Finebaum on ESPN. Mm-hmm. No more Mouth of the South. Now, it seems like he could go on for several more years now.
Yeah, I think so, right? But I think to answer that question, we partially have to go back a little bit. And I think that the other question that comes to my mind is, what do you think really happened with ESPN kind of momentarily sidelining him? He did miss appearances, but then by the time it got attention, he was back. And ESPN was able to deny that he had been punished or benched in any kind of way. But clearly, I think something happened there. What do you think it was?
So I don't know if you listen to the press box, Brendon. They have they have kind of a tradition there of kind of giving the most favorable read to people in positions of power, just kind of play situations out. And try not to speculate. That's what I've done with the Paul Finebaum situation at ESPN with his benching. I don't think there was any directive from ESPN executives that said, all right, like we're taking Finebaum off the air, at least temporarily, to try to figure out what his future is with the network. I'm thinking that it was more the show producers that probably made that decision, because you hear Paul Finebaum go on Outkick and you say, well, maybe we don't want him on the show a day later. That might be a little controversial. We'll find someone else. And then there's also a theory along those lines of, if Paul Finebaum is going to run for Senate, we need a Paul Finebaum replacement for this show. We need to find someone else that can talk college football for us that's not going to be Paul Finebaum. So I think there was logical reasons why the individual shows would have decided not to put Finebaum on the air that week. So I kind of am siding with the ESPN corporate narrative here that like I don't think there was any directive to keep him off of ESPN.
I could see that, and I think the most conspiratorial answer would be because he's a Republican, right? And I don't think either one of us think that. What I think could have happened is they just didn't appreciate that he didn't give them advance notice. I could see that he maybe kind of freelanced his way onto this appearance with Travis originally, and then it kind of surprised people at ESPN, and maybe they were just getting their bearings of like, okay, are you actually announcing? When? What's the timeline? What's your, and that could be why that blip happened. Either way, I think one thing I could see happening is, because of the increased leeway that ESPN now gives its talent, especially its star talent, which I think he qualifies as, to talk about some of these things, maybe he can satisfy his urge to weigh in and be part of this circus, which I'm calling it a circus. He probably would not call it a circus, is to go on shows like that more. Just be a regular on the Clay Travis show from now on, or, I think it's called the Outkick show, whatever. Be on Fox News, do stuff like that more regularly, and maybe that can be somewhat of a compromise. But like this, again, this guy's 70 years old. He's far closer to the end of his career. I don't think if we're talking about just, okay, he's not going to do this, what's the future at ESPN? I don't think he's going to be adding new roles and responsibilities to his plate. I think he's just going to be Paul Finebaum, but maybe we'll see more of him in these other arenas because of everything he said.
Yeah. I think if we were to see action on ESPN's part, it's going to be because he went directly to one of ESPN's biggest and most outspoken critics to make this announcement. Like, I'm sure, I can readily admit here, I'm not visiting Outkick.com very often, but I'm sure if you went on their homepage, most days you're going to find some sort of headline about ESPN or an ESPN talent, something they said or how ESPN covered a certain thing and why it's wrong and it's woke and it's, ESPN's liberal bias showing. I think that more than anything is probably what would upset ESPN. But I do agree with you that like a person of Finebaum's stature kind of has the leeway to do what he wants if he wants to be more like Stephen A. Smith and be more outspoken on politics and appear on cable news and political podcasts and whatever. I think he has that cachet. I mean, I think he was on CNN like a day or two ago.
Yeah, and that's Caitlin Collins, who's a Bama super fan who always has brought him on to mostly talk sports. But yeah, I could see, could he be a Charles Barkley, Stephen A. Smith type of character where he's in the mix on this stuff? I think I could see it, and he does bring a perspective from actually living and experiencing a part of the country that goes overlooked often in those conversations that I think has value. Now he's stepped in it with, the Bomani Jones argument from many years ago and some things like that will bring negativity toward ESPN that they might not appreciate. But hey, if you let Pat McAfee have the president on, or you let Stephen A. Smith do what he does, and any number of these other things with these borrowed talent types of arrangements, then you can't exactly turn around and tell people no quite as easily as you used to be able to. My question for you last here is, Front Office Sports put a list out when we still weren't sure about Finebaum's destiny on this of 11 people that they think could replace him. And we have a gimmick like this we might dip into when we need an episode here on the play-by-play soon. But I wanted to see who you thought was the most likely. There's some names here I will admit I don't know about, so I'm not even going to list them. But you think he is one of the primary voices on the SEC Network pregame show alongside now Tim Tebow, which is, pretty powerful slate there. But he's also a regular on Get Up and First Take and numerous other SportsCenter and podcast appearances that he does at ESPN, as well as his show, which, is radio in that form going to be something that matters going forward? I guess that's up to what you think. But they had Josh Pate, Greg McElroy, Cole Kubelich, who I think is actually currently recording the Awful Announcing podcast, so we will hear from him more soon. Marty Smith and Ryan McGee, Alyssa Lang, or Booger McFarland.
I think out of all those, Josh Pate kind of fits the bill the best. That's kind of already his style of content is what Finebaum does. I don't know if Pate does like kind of the callers like Finebaum's show is famous for, but if we're talking about the type of commentary Pate is giving, I think that's more analogous to what Finebaum does on a daily basis than most of the others on the list.
Big picture commentaries, not about the zone coverage that Bama's playing, but
exactly.
Yeah, I think and he has a radio background also from the South. Pate was first on their list, and I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I actually have one more question for you. Do you know Paul Finebaum's contract situation? Like, do we know when his contract's up?
I feel like it was discussed when he originally went on Outkick and talked about that stuff. But I don't think this was tied to his contract being up. If I remember, it wasn't like, I think it was just the nature of, hey, the primaries soon, make a choice. Right. So I think he's locked in.
Okay. I think then like we know his immediate future with ESPN is probably safe, but I wouldn't be surprised if, ESPN has a pretty long memory about this stuff. I wouldn't be surprised if he struggles to renew his contract when it comes time with ESPN because of this.
So Michael McCarthy wrote in early November that his contract runs through mid-2027, which I would imagine is just like post-college football season and draft, So 2 years or one and a half years.
All right. Well, we might be revisiting this topic then. We got one more for you guys on this fine Wednesday, and that is Max Kellerman making his return in earnest, I think you could say, to sports media, and honestly breaking his silence on the Bill Simmons podcast earlier this week. Kellerman discussed his departure from First Take for the first time publicly. Pretty much, I think I would sum it up by saying that Stephen A. Smith did not want a debate partner that was as competent as Kellerman. Do you agree with his assessment of things?
Well, so look, Max Kellerman's probably one of the most confident people that we cover. If you ever hear him speak, I don't think he will ever have a bad thing to say about himself. So not a surprise that he would take that tact. And also he was doing it in a pretty teasing kind of lighthearted way. So I don't think it's really any sort of like revealing thing. I think it's pretty clear Stephen A. Smith wanted that show to be his. I thought the most insightful part of what he said, though, was the idea of how Stephen A. Putting his thumb on the scale of what that show is going to be has directly led to the stature that he now holds there, right? Because I think the way Max put it was like, if you manufacture the show into being a solo act, it's easier for you to make an argument to management that the show is your solo platform, when it wasn't ever that until very recently for Stephen A. And I think that is probably pretty true. And it has certainly paid off for Stephen A. to be making the money that he is now. So that was the part that I kind of took away as far as the First Take stuff goes, is like, yeah, Stephen A., you can directly trace the monster payday he got and the freedom he got earlier this year to orchestrating the exit of Max Kellerman a few years back.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. And I also found interesting Kellerman saying that out of all the on-air partners that he's had over his career, that Stephen A. was kind of the only one where he never felt like they were actually building, any chemistry or any bond outside of the show. He said, like, when the red light comes on, like, the show was fine. There was nothing wrong, but he just never felt a deeper connection with Stephen A. And I found that interesting. I kind of wonder if Stephen A. is one of those people where it's kind of hard to get past the on-air persona and actually develop some sort of deeper relationship with.
Well, and not to get too far distracted, but it definitely doesn't help how often Stephen A now is remote. I mean, I think that often watching that show, like he is just never there and he's always on. I'm not saying he is not working, but he is very rarely in the studio compared to what we were used to before. I'm sure it's more than half the time, so I shouldn't say rare, but it's noticeable. And I think if you listen to Skip talk, it was like that with those two. It was like that with Skip and Shannon. Um, Obviously, Stephen A. being remote now signals that's not like the highest on his priority list to have that kind of rapport with everybody around him necessarily. And honestly, what it makes me think too, Drew, is like how big of a loss, how much bigger of a loss it makes the Molly Qerim departure seem like, because I would say that's the only person I ever felt like Stephen A. Smith had that level of real chemistry and care for that he ever worked with on air. I mean, he's bashing Carrie Champion actively right now, who was the previous anchor of that show, right? So, yeah, there's a long list of people that Stephen A. did not work well with, and he's the last one standing, which is great. But I mean, this is something that Bill Simmons was kind of talking about in that interview as he kind of weaved these questions in, which was like, what would ESPN, that show, of course, would be different, but like ESPN would feel a lot different if Kellerman hadn't left, solely because I think it wouldn't feel so much like, Stephen A. Smith Palooza over there, the way that people have grown tired of it feeling. Like, it's kind of an interesting what if to just think like, what if Stephen A. just had a counterbalance for the past 5 years?
Yeah, that is a really interesting, counterfactual to think about. Like, would Stephen A. be hosting a Sirius XM show? Would he be delving into politics like he is if he had someone to kind of check him on a daily basis? I mean, he's kind of been able to run wild over there. It's a really interesting thought. One more question for you, Brendon, before we get out of here. Max Kellerman is launching a podcast with The Ringer alongside Rich Paul. I think details are rather sparse about it, like what the topics are going to be and what they'll talk about day to day. But what do you think of Kellerman, making his reemergence with Rich Paul at The Ringer?
I have not personally found Rich Paul, as he's ventured out as a public figure more and more. He had a book tour. He's been on the McAfee show quite a bit. Things like that, to be that compelling of a character, which is not really a fault of his. I think that, there's plenty of insight to be gleaned from an agent, especially an outsider who worked his way into that world, and somebody who's been so closely associated with the most prominent NBA figure of our lifetimes and that kind of stuff. Like, I am interested in the idea of Rich Paul, but it feels like the main reason I don't love it is he just doesn't seem to have an awareness of the pulse of, the sports conversation, because he's a freaking agent. Why would he? Why would he care about, what Reddit is buzzing about on a random Thursday? So if that changes, I guess I could see it working. It's not who I thought Max Kellerman would go toward, but I just think it's a strange pick to not just find somebody who does that same job, who you can build chemistry with. But Max had a long time to think about this. So if he thinks that's what's going to work, he probably, knows more than I do.
Right. And I think Simmons, when he was talking about it with Max and Rich Paul, just kind of sat back and by the sounds of things, just listened to them conversate and said, this sounds like a Ringer podcast. So,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
There's few other people that I would trust more to, be able to identify what makes a good podcast than Bill Simmons. So I think we'll have to wait and see on that one. But I do agree, it is an odd pairing on paper.
Do you think it's just podcasts and fight commentary for Max? Like, is that just what Max Kellerman is as a sports media figure now?
I wouldn't be surprised, because I think we all understand the reason he was no longer doing sports media was because he was happy receiving that paycheck from ESPN when, kind of abiding by his non-compete clause. So by that standard, it's like, all right, well, maybe he thinks he's a made man and doesn't really have an urge to be a super front-facing person in sports media anymore. I think most people you see get ousted from a place like ESPN are pretty eager to get back and go somewhere else. But we didn't see that with Max, and so maybe he's just fine living his lifestyle with a nice, nest egg from ESPN.
He became famous and prominent so young in New York City with the music career and the boxing stuff and everything that he was doing that he's only 52, been around forever, but young still. So it's a fascinating guy. I just don't know how many Max Kellerman fans there are, people who are like, I am burning to hear from him as an individual. He's always been a part of something else. So maybe that changes.
Yeah. All right, Brendon, thank you for joining us on the play-by-play here today. We will have one more episode coming for everyone later this week. Please remember to like, subscribe, listen to us wherever you get your podcasts, and we will see you once more this week.